feel like everybody's right and everybody's wrong.
100%. Why is this important? Why are we even going here? He's helped a lot of guys. He's also not had success with a lot of guys.
Come in with a purpose, and they're very intentional with what they do and how they do it.
From the majors to the sandlot, baseball and softball share space in one place. Welcome to the Farm System.
Fellas, welcome back to another episode of The Farm. And the ladies!
You waited
Sorry,
a minute that
I
time.
literally delayed. I'm sorry, I saw Cody's body flinch. I was like, damn, my Cody.
I was almost out on the podcast after that.
But when we were going in, look, Code, today we're going to get into, I think it's a big thing of, man, like, one of the things I think that just holds us back, I know that even I recognize this within, myself too, of like many instances where, you come into things of like learning. I think one of the biggest issues with learning has nothing to do with logic, and it has everything to do, you could say ego, but I'd say emotional. Like there's a lot of emotional barriers that come back from us, like learning things. And even, too, we start to have, confirmation bias or any of these other things, emotional ties into what my grandpa taught me, what these things. And we briefly talked about some of these things with Peabody when he was here back in that episode. Shout out to my boy. But, when we talked there as being like, man, like there's so much to learn from so many different sides of what people do well. And I think, for example, I've had many guys that either have hit with me and then went and hit with somebody else and or hit with a whole bunch of a guy. Let's say like Lane Adams, for example. Lane Adams, for example, like he hit with so many guys and then came back and then hit with us, when I was back at 108 at the time. And so like all of those things, at the time you can learn that everybody has like little pieces. I think Randy Sullivan, talks about this a lot too, about like, hey, we're all wrong. We're just all working to be less wrong. And again, along with that, we're also all right, right? We all have pieces. We all have things from that other side. But when I think about, learning in general, who cares if it's about a swing? Who cares if it's about pitching? Who cares if it's about infield? Who cares if it's about baseball? Who cares if it's about whatever, right? About cooking, right? Is that there's these emotional barriers that get in the way of our growth. And so I kind of wanted to have a conversation about that, about like, man, like first off, probably some techniques as well about like things that you've learned. Cause I think that actually now that we're on this topic too, Coda, I think this is something that you're really good at, is not personalizing. And I think along with that, like it could be seen as a humility trait, but I think also on the other side of that too, I think it's just this emotionally grounded state that I think you have to be in to like take in, feedback, criticism, whatever those things might be, and go from there. And I think that's a thing that we all can struggle with. It can be rooted to other things. So I kind of wanted to open up that can of worms. And
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to just my foundation and my faith is I haven't created a single thing that's on this earth. So for me to think that I know something more than everybody is just, it just doesn't line up with my moral values and what I believe.
For sure.
And so right off the jump is I didn't create this human body, but I am trying to figure out how it works every single day. But I'm also open to the fact that I didn't create it, and that 10 years ago we thought something different about the body, and so 10 years from now we're going to think something different as well, right? And like even if it's just better understanding what we're already on the path of knowing now, like, or we're just completely wrong about what we know now, and like how we understood it's just wrong, or the studies that we valued were just how they were conducted were wrong,
or
right?
is out of context.
Yeah,
right?
out of
like,
context.
We're right, but not all the time. In this certain circumstance with this context, it is correct.
Yeah, and so I just think it goes back to like I haven't created anything that's on this earth.
Yeah.
I'm just a part of that growing process of everything that's on this earth, and also too, I don't have to be a part of everything that is happening on this earth. It's my choice to be a part of what I want to be a part of. And so it's I think it's like very gray. I know people like black and white. They like, well, this is the answer, this isn't the answer. And it's like if something is the answer, quote unquote, like that makes me feel more anxious than there being like this open thought that there could be more to it and that there could be learning, because it's like, okay, well, that means that everybody has to do it this one way, whatever this is. And then we get closer to being just replicas of each other and robots. And it's like, that thought is more scary to me than.
I think like you're saying too, right? Like biblically that doesn't even line up too, where, many times throughout the Bible it talks about, and I think the wisdom here is right, is like we all, and again, let's say you're not faith-based at all, right? Let's go with this idea, right? And this is the wisdom that's coming from the Bible here, right? That God has designed us where we all have different talents, skills, gifts that he's given each one of us, right? We could all say that, like, let's say you're, like your stuff is rocket ships. You love rockets, Elon Musk or whatever, right? Like you love rockets. He tweeted the other day, I have rocket ships. I thought that was hilarious. Or spaceships.
Yeah. I was gonna say, good for you, bro.
It is a funny statement. But, also too, you taking that, right? And it's like, you might be really skilled in one area, but guess what? You're probably not as a doctor. You're not, and again, maybe you have both. Okay, well, there's gonna be silos. There's no way we're gonna have, again, you're not gonna know how to maybe build a house, or maybe you don't know plumbing, or maybe you don't know, you're not the best ping pong player, or you don't know all this, the techniques around ping pong, whatever that is, right? Like we all have our own little niches, and we all kind of work together as a society that provide, we have passions that are all different things. Maybe, again, like Taylor, it's like, mental health and all these other things. It's like, okay, amazing, right? Even if it goes even more niched, okay, well, drug addicts, or, wherever my passion is. And there's all of these niches within all of it. And I think, along with that is that when we view that from that other side is like, man, God's going to make people passionate about particular subjects, right? And they're going to go really far down that way. And maybe it might not even be, you might not even think of yourself as an expert. It's just something that, could be a hobby of yours that you just know a lot about a particular subject. Because it's just something that fuels you, right? When you're passionate about it, you're not even thinking about it. It's just what you do. Like I do that constantly too. Like I told you, it's like, I might even be in church, or we're out in public or whatever. I see people like with their hands up in church, and I'm looking at their scat function and like, what's going on. It's just like where my brain likes to grab to. Like I love a lot of things with the human body. Now, am I the leading expert in the world on how the body functions? Absolutely not. Now, if within a niche, if you get down niched enough, sure, maybe I know a lot about a particular subject or something like that. But again, along with that, it's like, there's obviously a healthy respect of, across the board of, keeping that in mind, that that's just not how we're designed, nor, like, as you're saying, right? Someone gave this analogy to you the other day, is like, okay, if you look at the entire universe, everything that there is to know about everything, right? How much is in humanity, how much do we know? Okay, a fraction, right? We're talking about probably less than 1% of all the knowledge in the world about everything that there is to know. So how are we going to have this closed book on this is it? There's no other knowledge. Like as soon as you, like you said, as soon as I think my body does that too. The same thing as yours, or which I think is everybody's, is when we say like this is it, and like there's no expansion, there's nothing else to learn. There's no it's a dark world in my opinion. I don't like that feeling either.
No, and I think that goes back to again, more than anything, my faith. And even though like I haven't created anything, and there are inventions, right? But again, I view it as like that's just other things that were created that I was gifted the idea, whether it be, all of your guys' ideas that I have a conglomeration of in my head, and then it made up a new exercise for whatever reason that people haven't seen before. Like I didn't create the exercise in my opinion. I just took a bunch of pieces that I've heard or seen or grabbed from someone else and tried something, and I was like, cool, that works, or that didn't work, or whatever, right? And two is also, like, to what you're saying is realizing too is like you're gonna be wrong so often, and so personalizing it, just in my opinion, just doesn't make sense to me. If you take it so personal, it's like you're always going to be, I mean, I dealt with this in college where it's like a perfectionist, and call it like anxiety, but it was just like these expectations that I put on myself to get whatever destination I was trying to go to. And it's you're just going to be wrong so often. It was creating more anxiety, and then running down it's like a hamster wheel, because I'm trying to get to this end goal of being right, and it's like, well, what is right?
I agree. I think it's a huge piece. There's like, well, why, again, it's something deeper for us to evaluate, is like, well, why do you need to be right? And I remember asking, having those questions, and I had some really great just mentors and things around me that we would have those conversations of being like, hey, like you could be, let's say you are right, but
Mm.
the other people around you think you're wrong.
Mm.
But you're right. You
Mm.
are right. What is that desire in you that you need them to know that you're right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's different levels of degrees with that. I think obviously as human beings, we have this desire to be affirmed
Yeah.
and awarded for our efforts or just like seen, right? Which is, I
Mhm.
think when we talk about that is more like a faith thing, right? Like
Yeah.
we want to be seen and be unique and unicorns and X, Y, and with that. And within our faith, like God does see you that way. He
Mhm.
sees you like, again, he designed you
Mm-hmm.
on purpose and with a purpose,
Yeah.
right? And so when with that, right, that what we're seeking and desiring from humans, right, we can't receive that, right? So then we
Right.
end up we come up with all these things, we stack all this stuff in between, and then we end up responding, personalizing things, all these other things, which like psychology would line up with, but from our perspective, like spiritually, you come
Mhm.
underneath that as the foundation, is like you have all these things that we're desiring, but like the solution being pointed back there. And again, my lens from that side. But I think also, you come back into that, and it's just realizing too is like, at the end of the day, again, if you go back 20 years ago, like there's things that people, like this is it. Like at one
Yeah.
point, right? At one point, and I guess there's still some people out there. Shout out to my boy Evan Wise. He always makes this. He'll give people a run for their money on flat Earth. Like he just will like just make them like really think about things. And
Yeah.
not that he believes it, but like it's he's so funny
Yeah.
from that side. But it's like at one point, like that was it. Right? It's just like, we believe that this was 100% true. And so when someone brought up the contraring views on that, or even too, I always look at like what we do, and everybody I feel like should look at what they do too, is like, you're an artist. Like no one can make art like you make art, right?
Right.
They could mimic some of your techniques. They could do some of these things and they can learn from you just like any artist can. But
Right.
how you collect, it's artistic, just how you collect information and how you arrange it and
Mhm.
what you use and what you filter and what you don't. That's so you.
Mhm.
Right. And that's something that, you can take from some other people, but like, and little concept, but nobody will ever be you. And so I think that that's such an interesting thing. Like when you pull that into it, it's just like, hey, like if you get just really cultivate a feeling in your soul of just curiosity,
Mm.
and when you do that, you don't necessarily, I think you get into a place too, especially when you're rooted or grounded, or your foundation is strong, where when other people talk, like they could have whatever responses, they could act any way that they act, they can not respond in ways that normal people would respond, or ways that you would like someone to respond, or X, Y, and Z. And it just being you in a place where, hey, like I'm not looking for your response, right? I'm in such, like, again, what I'm receiving is coming from God in that same way. Everything I need is coming from God in that way.
Yeah.
And again, like I don't need you to act a certain way. I don't need you to respond in this way. I don't need, these things from you. Now, again, along with that, can I communicate, hey, when you do this, this makes me feel this way? Yeah, that's like a whole nother, leaf. But what I'm saying is from a foundational standpoint, is that you get from this other thing is like biblically, the actual verse is when you seek rewards from man, right? Or if you, the
That's what you'll
trophies,
get.
that's you're going to get that alone. If you're seeking their praise, you're going to get that alone, and that's exactly what you'll seek. When in reality, again, along with that, I think that's what it starts bringing in these nasty toxins that we're going to have, inside of us as well. It's like when we start seeking those things. What would you say your mindset is? What would you say your mindset is when you hear information that's contrary to what you currently believe? Like, what would you say that process looks like for you?
I mean, I think it also goes back to my faith, is understanding everyone's on their own walk and at a different point in their walk. And so, like, we were talking about this when you started doing like the Instagram Bible study, was I put so much time and like stress or worry into what was my first one going to be over. Is that was such a big deal, because I was like, I want to hook them in. And it's like, well, one, like, also goes back to something we talked about a long time ago, probably like a month ago, was like my church back in Colorado was like, well, are you the one saving them? So why are you so worried? It's like, it's not you saving them anyways.
For sure.
And so it's like a conglomeration of that. But I mean, same thing is, they're at a different point in their walk than I am, and they probably look at the stuff I say and think it's all wrong too. And so the way I see it, in my opinion, is one, there's some people that don't ever want to change. And
Yeah.
again, it's like, am I saving them? No, I mean, I can continue to do what I feel is right in my heart,
Mm,
and walk my path. And
sure.
I genuinely believe that what I do is to help other people,
Yeah.
and it's more of a servant mentality than it is a selfish.
Yeah.
And so then I believe deep down in my heart that if I continue to live my life that way, that they'll be impacted in some way to some extent
Uh-huh.
by how I live my life. But again, like in general, I think the people that just disagree with maybe how I view things or do things or how you do or whatever, I just view that they're just at a different point in their walk than we are.
Yeah.
And again, like, me and you are at different points in our walk. Like you were training athletes before me,
Yeah.
and your background was slightly different than mine. So it's
Mhm.
like we're gonna have some similarities because of our similar backgrounds, but a slightly different path to where we're at.
For sure.
And like, that's okay.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Well, I think it's also a very unique thing, like you're talking about, right? Like you could have literally all the same information as somebody else. You can know it to the same extent if that was even
Yeah.
possible, right? But how you then communicate it, how you
Mhm.
connect to that, like those are all
Yeah, way
those
different.
there's also all unique things that are going to be as well, and also to who, when, where, what's the relationship between you and that athlete, that person, that other things is going to also dictate a lot of how things are consumed. Again, I've mentioned the book a couple times, but one of my favorite books is Thanks for the Feedback.
Mhm.
And that book talks a lot about like how your relationship dictates your communication and how it's received, right? Like
Mhm.
if your mom said that to you compared to some random guy on the internet, like how you would respond.
Mhm.
Maybe good or bad, right? Maybe you take it more personal because it is your mom, or maybe you
Right.
take the guy online more personal because it's not your mom, right?
Yeah.
It's not coming from a place where you don't have a love as a foundation. I mean, your guys' relationship, and I think that's a big opening there is that you. I think it's really hard to consume information. I think one of the ways, one of my coaches, I said this line a lot, like, don't hear the bark, hear the message.
Mhm.
But you got to separate the two. And one of the things within feedback, and that book kind of talks about too as well, is separating feedback, right, or learning, or what somebody else's ideas are. Even too, like that's also feedback too. If you're just reading about or you're hearing somebody else talk about how they think
Yeah.
about things, that's still feedback, right? And so I think when you take that and you have to separate who it's coming from, because that's our human,
Mhm.
right? Our human wants to hear who,
Yeah.
how they look, how they deliver it, all these other things. I want it packaged up in this sweet little bundle, and I want it to sound this way. And if you said it this way, I would take it in. Yeah. Like, but also too, as a learner, and I think me and Taya, this podcast a while back ago where we talked about that, is the separation is like I have to take objectively what is actually being said
Mhm.
and detach that from how it's being said, how it's being delivered,
Yeah.
the tone that it's being, all these things that hold us back, which, yes, as a speaker, you want to continue to get better at doing these
Right.
things and how you deliver stuff. But as a learner, if you want to be an elite learner, you have to get better at looking at what is actually being said and take it away. And I
Mhm.
think, again, like even too, if you look at really successful people, let's say like CEO wise or whatever, let's say like you're Elon Musk, right? And you're trying to do something like you're trying to go Mars, X, Y, and Z, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so are you going to let how somebody presented something take away from this idea that could be one of the most groundbreaking ideas because of someone didn't deliver it in the tone that it
Mhm.
could have been delivered in? All things like listening to what is actually being said or what's being taught or success that someone might be having. I mean, like, okay, well, like, there's something to learn here. Like, again,
Mhm.
success leaves clues. Again, doesn't mean that they're 100% right,
Right.
but they could be 20%,
Yeah.
10%, 5%. We can filter those things.
Mhm.
And again, start to walk down those roads of not immediately being like, just completely throwing everything out as like trash. It's like,
Mhm.
it's not the way, it doesn't affirm what I currently believe. So,
Yeah.
I'm out.
Well, I mean, who is the guy that you guys always studied at Planet Fitness? You guys did one of his. He's like a leadership guru.
John Maxwell.
Yeah, Maxwell. I read one of his books, The Self-Aware Leader,
Uh-huh.
and one of the biggest things I took away from it was hearing the message that's actually being presented from people above and below you,
Mhm.
and understanding that their position's also going to
Unique viewpoint.
yeah, they're gonna how they present that message or what they're telling you. Like if you and Taylor tell me the exact same thing, just from a different viewpoint and life in general, let alone in the business, like
Mhm.
it's going to come off differently initially, but it could be the exact same
Same
message,
Yeah.
right? And so, what I take from that is a lot of people take a lot of things out of context without understanding the position that those people are in
Speaking
or
from-
what they actually mean from it.
Yeah.
And so they react emotionally, again, like you said, rather than really understanding the position that they're speaking from, right? And so, like, for example, we go yesterday, we'll just use it. One of our hitters was not having the best attitude, talked about it, didn't get better. And I just basically presented the situation like, hey, it's like, if you're going to bring the 5 other people down with you, don't be here. Like, you can go sit out there and you can wait. Like we're not going to do that here, period. But also I didn't want to be like, bye, leave, go home. Like, I don't want to cross that line either. Sure. But also, like, go take a break. And when you're ready, if you're ready, come back. Cool. Okay. Fast forward is the situation comes down to there's something externally happening away from baseball in his life.
Yeah.
That's happening. And again,
the poison's just getting
the position that he's acting out of is from that. He's reacting emotionally. But again, too, is 3 years ago, back before my last year of college, where I felt like I grew the most in some of these aspects, like, I probably would have wanted to just fight somebody. Like, that would have really pushed me, like, triggered me. Like, I've had people walk out of teams before, and I felt betrayed as someone who was on a team. And I feel like those kids in there training together are a team at the moment, right? They're all part of, like, the farm team, right? They should all be backing each other, right? And to walk out or to act that way in a team, it's like a trigger. And like, I had to catch myself. It was like, I don't know what he's possibly going through. And so, like, hey, like, let's go take a break. Like, you need to chill. Like, right now, like, you're not doing what you can and should be doing as a leader amongst the group that we have right now. But, initially I would say, like, I wanted to react emotionally. Like, I've had people walk out on teams before and leave, and I've seen what that's done to a team, and then how then we treat that player later in the year because of how they treated us. And so again, but also too, I'm glad that I've had that growth, because context, like, there's stuff going on away from baseball and training in his life that he needed attended to.
For sure.
And like a really emotional response could have been the last thing he needed in that moment too.
And that's like the Randy Sullivan's kind of statement about, like, knowing your athlete, right? Like, there's certain guys that, again, along with that, maybe even that conversation might have been too aggressive for him, right? But there's other guys that might be the perfect way, and maybe that's not stern enough for another guy.
Yeah.
Like, okay. And that's where, like, knowing your athlete and also where you're at with that athlete, right? Is this day 1 or is this, month 8? Is this year 14, right? Are you so
what's your
close?
goals too?
Yeah, for sure. Like, again, like, me and you can have conversations about things today that we wouldn't have month 1 or, all those other things, like, within our relationship. And so I think you got to take in all that context of, like, what is right and when, and, like, understanding all of those things. And then also too, leaving room. I oftentimes, even when I hear things, let's say if it's you hear things that are out in the space, you could call it gossip, you can call it whatever it is, right? And I go, when I hear those things too, it's like, I immediately now shift into, like, well, what was happening, right? Like, what was the real situation? Like, somebody might want to put a one tagline on top of a Twitter video and saying, this is what's happening. But it's like, okay, well, again, is that what's happening? Like, what is the context that's actually happening in the scenario? And so I think that becomes a big thing too, as well. It's like, most people, and this is actually sad to think about, right? But most people's disagreements, they don't even really disagree with each other. Like, the real issue is, like, there is a separator of miscommunication and or what am I saying compared to what you're actually hearing, right? Because, like, again, one question I'll ask all the time too is, like, are you hearing what I'm saying, or are you hearing your trauma? Like, are you hearing what I'm saying, or are you hearing your emotions, right? Are you hearing, because again, that's why I think it's so important too, where when you start having conversation too, especially on particular topics, like, hey, so what I'm hearing you say is, and you're repeating back to them, right? Because this even happens all the time in my personal life, where we'll start having conversations about those things, and, like, what they heard, right, is not even what's being said, right? And it's just like, no, I didn't say that you're a failure and you're never going to be successful in your life. Like that's not what I said, right? Like hear what I am saying, not what I'm not saying, right? And that's why I even say that line all the time too, is like, hey, hear what I'm saying. Like, don't hear, the statement I would say a lot too is don't hear what I'm not saying, right? And calling it out, like as you're communicating it, because it largely will get, with that, it's like, oh, so you're saying this. It's like you're saying, for example, if you're like, I love apples. Oh, so what you're saying is you hate oranges. It's like, no, I'm saying I love apples, right? And like, hear what I am saying. And that sounds so simple in that setting, but it might be, again, where you say something where you say, let's say it's, I really like this drill, right? Well, somebody else doesn't like that drill because a foundational belief that says that drill is terrible or whatever. So when you say you like that drill, you offend them because you don't agree with their ideology, right? And so that becomes offensive. And now anything you say past this point, I've already been triggered and I'm running past that trigger. And now anything you say, I'm just disagreeing with you because it's you saying it. Even though if my mom was saying it or my friend was saying it, I would agree with them and be like, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. But because of who it's coming from and where we're at, and that's where, like, again, like you're talking about a second ago, it's like, hey, you might need to take a step out and again, get regrounded. And some people it takes longer. Some people it's 10 seconds, right? And they can flip that switch.
Yeah, it's a process. And two, he was a safety for the Kansas City Chiefs. I forget his name, but he partnered with a company and he did like a mindfulness and meditation app. And I got into it. I think it was in between my senior year of high school and freshman year in college. And really like the foundational concept that they like hammered away was I think it's an acronym SEE is like separate from emotions and evaluate. And so the whole point of it was like step out of the situation, look at it from an outside perspective, evaluate it from that perspective, and then make a decision. And again, like when I started doing that, like the ability to separate took me a day at times, let alone to separate and then evaluate. And then by the time I get to the end of, the 5 years of college baseball, is like my ability to separate, evaluate, and then actually make an educated decision on, or ask a question if I wasn't educated on the situation was like, way, way faster. But it was something that, had to be worked on. Right. And so like, for example, like that hitter, like his ability to separate may take a day. Maybe the emotions were so strong, like tomorrow he woke up or today he woke up, feels good about it. Cool. Like sometimes like I got so mad in situations, like it did take me a day before I was like, all right, well, I'm glad I didn't go do something.
A week, a month for somebody. Like again, time being handling that way. Like some people, it takes years to get away from a situation where they can actually the emotions calm so much that they can start to like every time they think of that moment. And this is actually the brain side of what happens with this is like again when you have massive traumas, things like that happen. Again, like from what I've read about about the brain and what it actually does is like when you get these large spikes in emotion, it turns off the prefrontal cortex of your brain, and you're not thinking logically, which comes into that filtering process, right? But you're literally like reacting like an animal, right? It's just like whatever you're being emotionally led. You're just getting thrown around by your emotions, and like you're just angry, right? You can't think logically, and that's anybody can connect to that as just being like, hey, when you've been really angry and the things you've said and the how you popped off and how you responded to what they're saying and all those things, right? And we get messy, we get on that side, right? But there's events like that every time they're brought up, it immediately that process happens in your brain, and they can't have a conversation or start to unpack those things because emotionally they're still too charged about. And there's a lot of techniques that to work through that. But I think that's also a massive piece as well is like when we get into just all of that of going into these subjects. I think about this a lot with like God as a father to us and like how he hears us in this way is like, for example, is we cry out, we pray, right? Or when somebody else is communicating, with us, they're communicating something, but they're also underneath communicating deeper things, as they're speaking. And so you can hear what they're saying with their words, right? But to really hear, you got to hear what's underneath the words, right? And because I think that more dictates how you should respond comparatively to like just what they're saying, right? And so I think you get into that same way where it's like a lot of times, just like with a kid, like he might be throwing a tantrum, but it's not what he's saying when he's in his tantrum, like,
Yeah.
I hate you, you're the worst mom ever,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, what's he's really, well, he's just hurt because you took his toy away.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the real issue. And like, even too, sometimes in the same scenario, like, okay, well, what does that show up like in adults? Someone might respond really aggressively, maybe to something I post or something like with that, right? It largely, again, it has very little to do with like what I'm talking about. A lot of times it could be, again, if their friend presented it or whatever, right, it would be okay, or somebody else they respected or they had a relationship with or whatever those things are. Or again, it might have more to do with the subject matter, right? If the concept they agree with, but maybe it was the tone that I said it in. Maybe it was, again, it hit a soft spot. Or, again, someone say like you stepped on a nerve there, right? Or, whatever that is, right? That that's more of the issue than actually the context or the content that's being communicated. And that becomes, such a bigger issue.
Yeah. And kind of like we've talked about before on some of our shows was, the more you work, the more that you walk with God, the easier it is for you to determine whether it was his voice or what was being said, who was saying it, right? And it's like same thing too is when I see people do or say things that I haven't spent a lot of time with, because of that, again, foundational belief and value is I choose, again, I can't emotionally act because I don't know what they really meant by that, especially on a social media post. Like, somebody comment something on, something I posted on Instagram was like, you're doing it wrong, like, blah, 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 whatever. It's like, well, no, like, that's not what we were working on. So, like, what we were working on, was right. But like if I was working on what you're talking about, for sure. Yeah, I get it. But again, like they didn't understand where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Right. They haven't spent enough time to understand why we were doing what we were doing.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, like for them to do that, and then I can think back at like 99.9999% of arguments or fights I've ever had with anyone. And I can look back most of them probably with my brother because he knows how to push my buttons. But it's like, it's like they do something, and my brother in this instance sometimes intentionally, to get that reaction out of you. And then I look back, I look back and I'm like, okay, it was that exact moment that made me react that way. Right, rather than it being like I was going to react that way the whole time. No, it's like I can literally look back at the exact phrase or the exact action that was done, and I'm like, well, that's why. That's 100%. That was what triggered me, right? And it's like, okay, well, when you can really look back and evaluate that, well, then you can start to, and then also to, shout out to journal it is, and identify triggers. It's like, okay, well, now I can see the trigger coming before. It's like, oh, last time we started talking about this trigger happened. So now I'm prepared for it. Now I better know how to handle what's probably going to happen in this conversation. It's probably going to trigger me, right? And then, obviously, it's harder when you don't expect a trigger to come. It's like, you freaking comment on a social media post randomly in the middle of the day and you're like, gets you all fired up. It's like, that's harder. But as you practice it, it gets easier to not react emotionally.
I think so. Not to run past the journaling thing, I think one reason that makes journaling so powerful is there's not a human that you're talking to in that moment, right? You're just unloading, right? What's scrambled, what's going on. And so you can be, and also too, that because of that, you have you're not triggering somebody else that is in that moment, and they're responding to your trigger, and you're just triggering each, running back and forth. So I can get these emotions out, right? Well, what happens is when I get all those emotions out again, and I start to calm down, right? Prefrontal cortex kicks back on, and then now all of a sudden I start thinking. Now I can actually unpack. Well, and you said this, and this really made me mad because of this, and this, and blah, 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 blah. And this is why even like therapists are the same way. It's like where they can be impartial, right? And then you can just be sharing what is going on, right? And it's not about them. They're just there to filter and hear what like the underlying, and a lot of times be just a sounding board of like, things that just need to get out, right? Like, I need to get some of these, I need my emotions to feel heard, or again, whatever that needs, so I can get to the underlying like real issue that's underneath there. And I think that's why it can be so powerful with that. And journaling is so powerful for so many different reasons. But when you're unpacking things, or you've had a really hard day, or, and again, also just even to help you, I think the other thing is too is start structuring your thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where when you're actually writing it down, it makes you slow down,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't write as fast as you think,
Yeah.
right? And so when you start writing, right, it slows you back down, right? It starts this great calming technique in that same way, and you can start to really unpack things, and then you can also then look back at those notes, right? Look at
Mhm.
how you dealt with that in the past, right? Or where you were at. Because I get Taylor and I were actually talking about this earlier. Is that a lot of times, especially when it's been a very traumatic event that's happened in your life,
Mhm.
and maybe when you're really angry, you can't. It actually. When you're in that fight or flight mode and you get really triggered like that, you have memory issues. You
Mhm.
can't remember what you even said. You don't
Mhm.
even remember, how you responded. I didn't do that. Like people literally will not remember, them doing things. And that's actually like that's a real thing. They're not like lying. A lot of times they could be lying, but again, a lot of people are not lying. They literally can't remember
Mhm.
because they were just in this such a heightened emotional state that part
Mhm.
of their brain is literally kicked off. And all of resources are going to this other side, and you can get better, and you can train yourself to obviously learn from those things,
Mhm.
and like learn how to process, learn how to unpack, learn how to do all that. And so those become like huge things. And then like the other part is as well as like then you go back into it. And man, I know one thing for me with journaling, at least, it becomes a very useful tool when you get really far away. So let's say it was years ago, and
Mhm.
you go back and read what you were thinking, how you were
Mhm.
processing, and it shows you the growth
The
that
growth.
you've had.
Yeah.
Man, like all of that was going on at the time, and then you look back and you're like, it gives you also an appreciation for how people responded to you when you were in those states, when you were
Mhm.
that immature, when you were getting triggered, and you didn't even realize that you were going through something,
Mhm.
and you grew through it. And I was like, man, that's how it happens too when we get back. We look back at our parents and we realize like how again like how
Yeah.
much of a little shit I was being,
Yeah.
and like my mom and my parents dealt with me, right, and how they
Mhm.
were again still showed me grace, still showed me love, all these other
Yeah.
things when I didn't deserve it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big piece. And one thing that I learned just of recently, a couple weeks ago, I would say maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, maybe, um, was I was actually with my girlfriend. I was realizing like, man, I feel like I need to talk to her like a child, but then and then immediately like that's really triggering. Like, what do you mean?
Mm.
Like you got to
Yeah.
talk to her but what I unpacked and I went a layer deeper. The reason I felt like that is like when I'm working with a kid, or when I'm like my nephew or any of those other things, I have a soft spot when I'm working. I have a lot more grace. I have
Mhm.
a lot more mercy. I have a lot more understanding. I have a
Yeah.
lot more compassion. I have a lot more empathy. I have a lot more things. But then when I have a hardening when I work with adults, because I start expecting these things out of them, and
Yeah.
I like laying all of my expectations on how I think they should handle things and how I
Mhm.
should X, Y, and Z, and I don't give them that grace. I don't extend them those things. And when in reality, in the same way with that is like, well, again, like we're all little kids.
Mhm.
We're all little kids, and when we look at the perspective of God looking at us, and like again how much we know
Mhm.
comparatively to how much knowledge is out there, and you're like
Mhm.
we're all just a little bit older kids,
Mhm.
right? And we all got our own things running around, and in reality we should treat each other that way. We should have that
Mhm.
same compassion that we have for a kid. And a lot of too, to be honest with you too, a lot of the traumas that people are responding from are traumatic events that happened when they were kids.
Mhm.
So when they respond that way, and we need to be more delicate, and we need to be more compassionate, and we need to be more empathetic, it's because of something that happened at that time, and it literally emotionally will stunt you in that
Mhm.
area if you don't unpack some of these things that have happened.
Mhm.
And so you start responding from that space. So like like maybe again on the same moment, like just like a little kid, sometimes they're pushing you away, but they really want a hug.
Mhm.
They really want to be close with you. They really
Mhm.
need compassion, even though they're stiff arming and all that. They're so used to isolating, and that's how they
Yeah.
dealt with things. And so a lot of times I think with that it's like you go into those situations, and it's how you would handle that. And it's not that you're never stern with a kid. It's not that you don't ever lay
Right.
boundaries. It's not that you ever do those things, but you lay all those things and you communicate all those ways, but with that empathy, with that compassion, with
Mhm.
again a foundation of love within that communication.
Yeah. No, and then to top on go on top of journaling is just asking questions.
Yeah.
'Cause, like I feel like those two things are like the king of everything when it comes to really understanding is, start journaling in those situations and start recognizing those. But then also be curious enough to ask questions yourself,
Mm.
but also to ask someone else. Like if you feel triggered by what someone else did, okay, well, like ask a question
Be curious.
about why they're, and you'll probably get to the bottom of it. Like,
Yep.
you know, there's something going on beneath that.
Yep.
That's just why. Now you don't take it as personal. You don't burn a bridge between someone because you just took it personal that they said or did something.
Yeah.
And you actually understand, like, they didn't actually mean that they hate me and that I'm the worst mom ever. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Exactly.
it just, there's something going
10
on
minutes from now,
underneath.
He's gonna be sitting on my lap.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, just asking questions, and then also to understanding that not every question you ask is going to give you the answer that you want to hear.
Yep.
Is like just because you ask a question doesn't mean you're going to get the answer you want all the time.
Well,
too.
and I kind of was thinking about this, actually, this analogy yesterday. I was driving home and my girlfriend works at a what do you call it? What's the name of it, Tay? Like a cosmetology school, right? And so again, people will come in, right, and they have certain type of hair and they want to have this other hair, right? And a lot of times they have to communicate to them like, hey, this is going to take multiple sessions, right, to get to from here to here, right, to get to where you would like your hair to be. All these things. Maybe it could be health, it could be the color, it could be like what you're asking for. And I think the same thing, like, again, you go sit down with a therapist too as well. It's like, dude, we're not going to be here tomorrow. And I think that's a lot of times we have these expectations. We come into these communications and we think this is going to be one combo and we're going to move on and we're going to be on the same page. It might take years of combos. It might take, you know, again, and we had to have those expectations of change those expectations that just because I'm coming and talking to you about something doesn't mean that when I walk out of here today, we're going to be on the same page, you know? And again, that communication is ongoing and ever present, right? And we have to continue that communication as we go as well. But I think that, like, that's the other thing as well, is it's also been a big thing for me as well, is just like understanding there's nothing that you can do. And this was a big growth for me to like be able to go carry this weight a different way, is that we're all going to be misunderstood, right? If you can hear a snip of time, you see, you know, one, you know, social media clip, maybe you overheard, you know, you overheard them talking about something, like you don't know any of the context, you don't know their heart, you know, X, Y, and Z. And also too, we're just humans and we're all got our own stuff mixed around, right? So there's plenty of times I've been upset with somebody that had everything to do with me and had nothing to do with what they actually did.
Yeah.
And when I can actually gain that awareness of understanding like what's my stuff compared to like what's their stuff, and that's an ongoing effort, right? That's not like a finish line, but an ongoing effort there of just understanding that, like, again, the curious side is what they said, you know, really upsetting to me? Is it how they said it? Is it who it was coming from? Is it the wrong timing? Is it, you know, all of those things? Was it the wrong setting, environment, right? Like we were out in public and we should have talked about that at home when it was just me and them.
Yeah.
Was it in front of other people, right? Like all of those other things that, you know, come into where you can start to actually get to the root of, you know, what's going on.
Yeah. And I think kind of just like wrapping up my final thoughts on it is like, it all kind of goes back to like communication at the end all of it all, is like, obviously, you know, the foundational pieces of like, you know, hearing the message, not the bark, all that stuff, like not that it's not important, but also to like being able to communicate what you feel, what you think, in a professional manner, I guess, or in a non-emotional manner, is just, it's extremely important. You know, too, I think I can't remember who said it. It might have been one of my coaches that repeated it from someone, but was like, you know, I can know everything there is in the world, but if I can't communicate it, I don't know it. Like I can't pass it on to you. And so again, like I'm only as good of a coach as I am a communicator. And so I can know all this about the body and how to teach I know the swing that well, but if I can't communicate it to little Jimmy, then what do I really know? You know, it's like, you got to be able to communicate what you know. And so, and then also to like, I kind of took this actually from on like TikTok. I got a lot of comedians on the timeline, and so it's actually funny. Is there's one currently. His name's Matt Rife. I'm sure you probably seen or heard of him, but I think it's really interesting because he takes a really different approach to comedy. Is like he just has conversations with people most of the time. Like he has some like set jokes, but for the most part, his bits are like conversation. And it's really interesting to me is like how he unpacks people's situation, like by just asking questions. And he'll ask another question, then I'll ask another question. And then obviously too, people's guards are down because it's a comedy show and stuff like that. But it's really interesting is like how much people open up and how he gets to these different areas of the conversation by just asking specific questions.
Yeah.
And then, you know,
his personality too. I think the other thing is with him is like, he's not really trying to attack you.
yeah.
Like he's being playful. And
Yeah.
He's messing with you, those things. And again, like I'm sure there's probably many clips that we haven't seen where
Where
actually
someone
been triggered.
then left.
And
yeah.
like left, I'm out of here. Like you make fun of me in front of everybody. But a lot of people too are not going to sit in the front row and at a comedy show. And especially if you know his style and all those.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's just really interesting. And then like that sales guy that you showed me is like they're really good at asking questions, like, and that's a form of communication. They're getting their point across by asking the right questions or the questions that they want to ask, and then they're listening to what's really being said and hearing the message within what they're saying, right? And then also too, it's like understanding yourself and like those triggers and the journaling and stuff. Like I said, it all goes hand in hand. But again, like asking questions in a way to communicate is just a really interesting way of gathering information and really listening to what's really being said or felt by that individual.
A technique I wanted to share too. One of the things, it's a form of journaling, but like in a different way, is one of the things that I would also do if, like, let's say I was gonna have a communication or some talk with somebody that is really triggering to me, right? And what I would do, and then like, a lot of times we get triggered, we respond, right?
Yep.
Especially that's my response too. Is like, I don't get quiet, like I'll fire back immediately, right? But again, it wasn't conducive to the conversation, right? So what I started doing was I would start writing down what they were saying, right? And I would write down the main points so that I'm, again, like, okay, what's my objective of writing right now? My objective of writing is to take his information or her information or whoever is communicating with me and writing those points down where, it's not to respond right now. It's, again, it pushes me into a space of like trying to comprehend and also looking at the main points. And then also too, to the other person, like I'll even say that before we start, like, hey, like this conversation is really important to me. And so like, I want to write these things down to make sure like I understand what we're actually like, what you're trying to communicate. And I want to make sure, and I want to repeat these back to you. Like, is this what you're saying to me or am I hearing it wrong? Right. And it started growing some awareness to me, but also too, it slowed me down and also slowed down. And again, kicked on that front part of my brain, right? When you have to write and you have to, again, in the same way, it's not just emotionally firing from that same way. And it becomes like a really useful tool when you're going into those conversations with someone that like, just might really trigger or it might be the situation that's really triggering. It might not even be the person. It doesn't matter who's communicating to you about it. It's like we all know that like there's something in somebody's life. We can think of a person that it doesn't matter who brings it up. If they bring up this type of subject, they're triggered. It doesn't matter about who it's coming from. It's just the situation itself that is very triggering. And so when you go into those things, like, and if that's something that you recognize within yourself and or that's something that you've recognized with a certain individual, they may be firing back because you're talking about it. And as you're writing those things down, it gives you a way of like, again, maybe more conducive conversation as well. That becomes, super useful. And so I know that's a technique that's really helped me in the past that, has really worked too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. I agree. I mean, I think, this whole topic, it can go a lot of different ways, but I mean, I just think, going back to the initial question is, I mean, everybody, again, like the Peabody quote in our little intro is like, everybody's right and everybody's wrong, about what,
and
how much,
100%.
Yeah. It's like about what, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, I really do feel that way. And it's like, even we could both be doing the exact same thing, but how we're doing it makes me more or less wrong than someone else. And reacting in an emotional way has historically never really ended well in any situation. And so,
I would say like tweaking that too is like, we're emotional creatures, but what emotions, right? Like if I'm listening with love, well, love is an emotion, right?
Yeah.
Like, or again, the feeling of love, right, is an emotion. And so or again, am I listening with care? Am I listening, with, there's good emotion that come along with it too, right? So it's like, in that same way is, biblically it just talks about not being emotionally led, right?
Yeah.
It's because our emotions lie to us every day, all day long, right? And so when we can get better at filtering those things, it gives us a more direct way. Because again, if we all can say this, I think this is a place that we can learn. If we're just emotionally led, where again, even I can be listening with love, all those other things, and I have great intentions, all those other things, but like the logic side's, super important, right? Is like, hey, like, again, that's what they say, like, don't bet on the team that you love, right? It's like, oh, I'm betting on them because I love them so much, right? It's
Yeah.
like, no, well, we need to look at this, and again, filter this out and like actually think through why we're going this direction and why. And again, I might not love the direction, right? But I know that's the right thing and I need to do.
Yeah.
I might not love waking up in the morning and going for a run or something like that. But like maybe that's what I need to do, right? Or whatever that is, right? And so just because you don't love the idea of something doesn't mean that it's not necessarily the right route. And it might not get you super excited, but it doesn't mean it's the right route.
Yeah.
Isn't the right route. And I think that that's a big thing as we go through it as well. It's like it's not about us being just unemotional robots.
Yeah.
It's just more about like again how we communicate and it being more productive.
Yeah.
And us moving forward and growing.
Yeah. No, definitely both ways. Like you said, it's like being unemotional is not necessarily good too, which can be a side that I personally would err on, is just separate completely from emotion. Yeah, and just be like, I'm not going to react at all. It's like, and don't let it, be the guy that hits a double and doesn't do a little double celebration.
Yeah, you gotta get your celly.
You know what I'm saying? And then also don't be the guy that hits a double and then smack talks the pitcher and tries to
off the bat by celebrating and gets tagged out.
Yeah, or something stupid. So it's like there's extremes to both ways, but
sure.
But yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's big. Yeah, and I mean, just to wrap it up, I think the big pieces here is as well as like, man, like you can never reach the peak of just being a better learner, right? And figuring out what are the things that are coming in between and like being in search of awareness. And I think that's the curiosity side. It's like, what is holding me back? What is holding me back from learning more information? Like there's other people around me that are better learners and, like how their brain works and how they process those things and what's holding, there's things that are going to be in the way for all of us. There's not none of us that have, again, there's no check mark. I'm the best learner in the world and there's nothing more that I could learn. Right. Like there's so many things of opening that, up and just being curious about yourself and figuring out, what is holding me back in those areas. And again, it's not about pushing those emotions away. Those emotions are like fireworks or alarm systems letting us know that there's something
feedback
here, right? There's something here underneath the surface for me to explore and like, figure out that as well. And like figure out techniques that could really help me push forward and grow and, be better.
Yeah.
And I think that's,
yeah.
big foundational, thing to grow faster.
Yeah. No, and again, like the feedback, and then also too, like throw back to an old podcast that I wasn't even here, is like the destination is the disease.
Yep. That's Adam Wise quote I saw from him too.
So
disease.
Yeah, and so it's just like, what are you striving to do and why are you so disciplined? But if you're attached to that end goal so strongly that ends up dictating all of your decisions and how you react, and then you're putting your faith in the wrong thing. But also too, it's not bad to be disciplined and to strive for things as well. And like you were saying, is like then you can start to take it as feedback and try to grow to be better every day. But also like if you don't get to where this end goal that you set is, then like that's also okay.
Yeah.
I'm that's gonna put me in a better position to then achieve what God puts on my plate next. Yeah. And so yeah, that's kind of my final thoughts with all of it too. So
mic drop. Let's let's pray it out and move on. Cool. All right. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for just having this conversation, God. We just hope that it touches somebody and softens them in some ways, makes them curious. God, we just ask that you spark that curiosity in ourselves, because we know that curiosity leads to awareness. And God, we just want to grow closer to you and just learn to navigate this world and from different perspectives that you can provide for us, God. And we know that we know so little about what there is to know, God. And just if you can open up and soften up those areas of our hearts that we've grown hard away from growing, God, we know that you can do it, and only you can touch us in those ways and remove those blocks. We ask for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, until next time, Farm System out.
Outskis.